Open our Bibles tonight to 1 Samuel chapter 15. And there are not 50 verses. Don't tell me I did this again. Anyway, that's 3 weeks in a row. I got to start opening my eyes when I type. Anyway, can you back up and start again? Oh. All right, well, that answered that. Anyway, I'm going to be using it later on. We'll find out exactly which verse. But it talks about Saul is the king. And while Saul is the king, it lists Abner as the captain of the host. So we find out, in fact, the first reference we have to Abner is that he is the captain of the host of King Saul. Now, as we look at Abner tonight, we see that he is one of those men that you could say he was a good guy or a bad guy or a good guy again, and you would all three be right. He starts out as a good guy. We'll see some things he did that were good. Then we'll see he turns into a bad guy. And then before he dies, he turns back into a good guy again. You'll notice this especially, and I'll try to point it out. You'll notice this when he's dealing with David. His relationship to King Saul doesn't seem to change, but his attitude and his actions toward David clearly change, and that's when he becomes the bad guy. Now tonight, a lot of the lesson is going to be history. But as I bring out the history, I want you, and I'll ask very nicely, I want you, as we're looking at history, to see if the actions of Abner somehow show up in you. Is it 14? You're so good. Thank you. Oh, you're very good. You're excellent. Thank you. I know what I did. Chapter 14 stops in the middle of a column in chapter 15, and when I looked, I saw chapter 15, and that's what I typed in. So, wow, that's 3 times already in less than a couple of months. Chapter 14, verse 50, I've already covered most of it, but we see that he was indeed the captain of the host. Now, I'm going to start out, and again, a lot of this will be history. But he starts out as a good guy. He starts out as captain of the host. We know that as the captain or the general under Saul's army, he had free access to the king. The general was free to come in. They didn't have secret service. They didn't have all of the things we have today. So the general would be a frequent guest in and out of the king's palace or the king's seat. We see that while Saul is king, you recall Goliath comes out and challenges Israel to a fight. The army withers away. They run. They're scared to death of Goliath. And finally, David comes on the scene, a little kid. I don't know, most people guess, most scholars guess, somewhere around 16 to 17 years old. Here comes this cute, handsome little red-headed kid out and says, "I'll fight." He goes out. Saul tries to force him to wear his armor. And David puts it on, and you've heard the expression David in Saul's armor. That would be like one of my grandkids, trying to wear my suit. It would be just about that ridiculous. So David goes out, and when he's going out, Saul asks Abner, whose son is this? He had just talked to David, just found out that David was willing to fight without all of the armor. So Saul asks, whose son is he? And Abner says, I have no idea. I don't know whose son he is. But then David kills Goliath, leads the army, fights the Philistines, come back after a major victory over the Philistines, and Abner is the one who takes this young kid into King Saul to receive a hero's welcome, to receive, medals and all the other things that go into it. It looks like Abner is a good guy. But the next reference, we see something totally different. Obviously, from the first point to my second point, something drastic has happened. Bible doesn't tell us what it was, but there is a complete change in attitude from what Abner had originally and what Abner has after David comes back. Many think, and I tend to agree, that he was jealous. We know King Saul was jealous because they said Saul had slain his thousands, David had killed his 10,000s. So we know Saul was jealous. But what was Abner? I just told you. How many of you remember what I just said? Abner was the general, the captain of the host of the army. He was the one who was supposed to be leading the army. He was the one, you got to be captain by being stronger than everybody else. We looked at that with some of David's mighty men. You got to be the captain by being stronger than everybody, fighting harder than everybody, and beating everybody else. That's how you got promoted. That's how Joab became the general under David. So it was a position of power and might. But when Goliath came, the army fled. David comes back victorious, not Abner. Abner was the one who, I'm rough, I'm tough, I am strong, I can beat anybody, I deserve to be the leader. And here comes this little, Bible speaks of him as being charming, good-looking, handsome, and red-headed. Here comes this little kid who now is stealing all of Abner's praise and all of Abner's, glory and all of the things that he had. We don't see much of Abner until David flees from Saul. If you recall, we spoke on Abiathar the other week, and we saw that David fled, went to the high priest, got Goliath's sword, got the priest his meat or food, and took off and fled. From the moment David fled, not every reference, but the references with Abner and David, Abner from that point becomes the bad guy. I'm preaching and not looking at my notes. Maybe that's better. Abner, perhaps jealous, from the moment David leaves, and you can see it if you read those chapters. Abner does a complete 180 and turns against David and begins to do everything he can to turn King Saul even more against David. Now, I'm going to give you some scriptures to back that up. In 1 Samuel 24, if you want to turn over a little bit, 1 Samuel 24, Saul has been hunting David. Saul has gone all over the country. Saul, as king, is now devoting almost all of his time looking for David, trying to kill David. In chapter 24, David is fleeing, trying to stay out of Saul's way. David and his men go into a cave to cool down and to hide. While they're in the cave, who comes in the cave to take a nap but King Saul? He has no idea David is back in the cave, but he goes in the cave to take a nap. While he's in there, David comes out, and some of his men say, "Kill him, kill him, kill him." And David said, "I will not lay my hand upon the Lord's anointed." But he does take his knife and just cut off a small portion of King Saul's robe. Then he goes back in the cave until King Saul wakes up. When Saul wakes up, what you always do when you wake up, you stretch, you do all of that stuff. Then King Saul went out of the cave back to his army. Once he gets outside of the cave, David comes out of the cave with him. David followed him. And when Saul gets a fairly good distance away, in chapter 24 and verse 9, David said to Saul, listen carefully, "Wherefore hearest thou men's words, saying, David seeketh thy hurt?" So we know from that verse, somebody was stirring King Saul up. Somebody was telling King Saul that David was trying to kill him or do him hurt. Saul was being influenced by somebody's words that they were feeding him and exciting him and turning him even more against David. Who was that somebody? We'll see some more examples, but almost every scholar that I know of agrees that somebody was none other than Abner. And we'll see why we think that. David makes a speech, "I'm just a flea on a dog. I'm nobody. Why is the king trying to kill me? Why is the king spending all of his time searching for me?" And David assures Saul that I am not going to hurt you in any shape, form, or fashion. In verse 20, David has had his say. Now King Saul begins to speak. And King Saul said in verse 20, "I know well that thou shalt surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in thy hand." Saul knew that God had appointed David to be the king after him. Now in verse 21, Saul knows David's going to be king. There's nothing he can do to stop it. God has decreed it. He cannot stop it. So he does ask a favor. "Swear now, therefore, unto me by the Lord, that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, and that thou wilt not destroy my name out of my father's house. I know you're going to be king. When you become king, all I ask is that you don't take it out on my kids and grandkids because of what I have done. My request is that you let my children and grandchildren live, that you don't cut off my seed, and that you don't destroy my name. Chapter 26. A short time goes by. In a very short period of time, King Saul is chasing David again to try to kill him. Instead of a cave, King Saul it becomes dark. King Saul finds a part of wilderness, and he and his men bunk down for the night to get a good night's sleep. Now, you'll read this if you read the chapter. The king was kind of placed in the middle of the group. The army completely surrounded him, so that the general was in the middle of this great big army. Nobody can get to the king without having to pass a large number of his soldiers. And the soldiers surrounding him would fight to the finish to make sure nobody got into the inner part and hurt the king. David and one of his men got into the inner part. And they find King Saul. His spear is stuck up by him, and his water jug is laying by him. And David takes his spear, takes his water jug, goes back over the hill, across the wilderness, back over to a hill, and he gets there, and he begins to shout and call King David. Look in verse 14. Chapter 26, in verse 14. David cried to the people and to Abner. Why did he cry to Abner? Obviously, he was the captain of the host. He was the general of the army. It was his responsibility to make certain that nobody got near the king. But most of us think that there was another reason. He singled Abner out because Abner was the one who constantly was stirring up Saul, getting Saul aggravated, and getting Saul to follow and try to kill David. Look on down in verse 15. This time he addresses Abner directly. Why did he want to make Abner look bad, which he's going to do? He said to Abner, "Art not thou a valiant man? And who is like thee in Israel? Wherefore then hast thou not kept thy lord the king? For there came one of the people in to destroy the king thy lord." The man that went with David wanted David to kill Saul. So there came a man in who wanted to destroy the king. But David goes farther. "This thing is not good that thou hast done." He's just pushing the buttons. "As the Lord liveth, ye are worthy to die, because ye have not kept your master, the Lord's anointed." He singles out Abner as the one that he is attacking, exposing in front of the whole army. He's telling the whole army that Abner is not a fit leader. He did not do his job. He therefore, David goes out of his way to make Abner look bad. But we'll still see more in a minute. Notice in verse 19. Now David is talking to King Saul. Now therefore I pray thee, let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If the Lord have stirred thee up against me, let him offer an offering. But if it be the children of men, cursed be they before the Lord. For they have driven me out. For they have driven me out this day from abiding in the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. So we know there were men who were agitating Saul, who were telling Saul things. David is out to hurt you. David is not looking after your best benefit. They, not King Saul, they are the ones who keep the pot boiling, keep Saul stirred up, and they are the reason you're chasing me. If it were God, we can make an offering. But how do you appease someone who's got it in for you, who is trying every way to have you killed? How do you appease somebody like that? Again, somebody was feeding King Saul. Well, later on, much later on, King Saul goes to battle with the Philistines. King Saul is killed in battle. And after King Saul is killed, all Israel knew that David had been anointed to be the next king. All Israel knew that. The whole nation, the northern tribes, the southern tribes, everybody knew David was anointed to be the next king. And many of the people of Israel were preparing to make David king. But Abner has different ideas. Abner, knowing that David has been anointed by God, Abner takes one of King Saul's son by the name of Ishbosheth, and Abner proclaims Ishbosheth king, not David. See, you put all of this together and you begin to get a full picture of Abner. Abner proclaims Ishbosheth as king of Israel over David. And because Abner was so well known, had always been highly respected, the northern tribes followed Abner and accepted Ishbosheth as their king. And during that time, Abner's army and David's army were in constant war with each other. Abner was the general of north. Joab was the general of the south. They both fought and fought. It was constant war during that time. If you get over in 2 Samuel chapter 3, you'll see that Abner had become more powerful than even King Ishbosheth. So much so that Ishbosheth feared Abner more than anything. Well, Abner's becoming more powerful, the king is becoming less powerful. One day, Ishbosheth calls Abner in and accuses Abner of having a physical relationship with one of his concubines, one of Saul's concubines. Abner becomes furious at such an accusation. And I didn't see this until I had just about finished my notes. And I saw it. I had to go back and put in a whole extra point. Abner gets mad, vows to give the northern tribe to David, but Abner never denied the charge. Ishbosheth said, "You had an affair with one of my dad's concubines." I looked, and if it's in there, I completely missed it. Abner never denied the charge. He got mad. He threatened to take Ishbosheth out of the scene, but he didn't deny the charge. I found that, from my perspective, I found that very interesting. Well, in 2 Samuel chapter 3, we see Abner turns back to a good guy again. He was a good guy until he turned against David. He became a bad guy. Now, since Ishbosheth made him mad, he once again turns into a good guy. In 2 Samuel chapter 3, and I'm not going to read all of it, but we find that Abner sends a messenger to David and says, "Let's sit down and talk. Let's see if we can't find a mutual ground that we can stop this silly war and that we once again can be one nation united together with David as king." So the messenger goes. They work out all the preliminaries. David has some requirements that have to be met. Abner meets all of those. Abner comes to Hebron, meets David, and they work out a peace treaty to reunite the country. Now, I know I sometimes think different than most people. But think about David in this case. You've got your number one enemy wanting to come and make a peace treaty. What would you and I do? Now, before you answer, remember, Abner is the one that turned Saul against David. Abner's the reason David had to live in the wilderness, hunting for his daily food, sleeping wherever he could find room. He lived a life of a nomad, looking, hunting, hiding, all because of Abner. All the things Abner had done to try to kill David. Abner had taken many of the northern kingdom and rebelled against David with Ishbosheth. And now Abner wants to talk peace. How many of us, and I put myself, how many of us would have had a very hard time believing Abner really wants peace? How many of us could have forgotten everything Abner had said and done? I know most of you, I know all of you, I know many of you fairly well, and I know me. I would have had a hard time believing that Abner had really changed. I mean, after everything he said after everything he did, after putting Ishbosheth over David, after everything, now he wants to talk peace. How many of you, and you, again, you touched on this a little bit in Sunday school this morning. How many of you, when somebody offends you, because you covered hate and those things, bitterness and malice, how many of us would have said, whoa, I want an apology first. I want you to admit what you did. I want you to tell the world what you did against me. See, once spoken, or is it once spoken, you can't unspeak it, or something along that line? What was it you said? You don't remember either? I'm sorry. Yeah, you can't bring back somebody after you kill them. I thought he said something about words in there. Maybe I dreamed it. How many of us would have, with open arms, received Abner and then sign a peace treaty? How many of us could have forgotten everything Abner had done? Abner and David signed the peace treaty. Abner heads back up north to get the elders of the Israel to bring them back and to transfer the kingdom over to David. While he's gone, Joab comes in and finds out that David and Abner had signed a peace treaty. Joab lies, tells Abner, hey, we need you to come back. We left out something. Abner returns, and Joab takes his sword and plunges it under the fifth rib, and kills Abner. Abner had killed Joab's brother during war. Joab never forgot it. And Joab killed Abner because he had killed his brother in war. We have a lot of information about Abner's funeral. Don't usually spend much time on funerals, but part of the funeral, David found out what had happened. Joab had committed cold-blooded murder against Abner. David ordered Joab and all of his men to rip their garments and to put on sackcloth and ashes and mourn for Abner's death. And then what would be and is David's final comments in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 33. David is giving the words at the funeral, and he said in verse 33, the king lamented over Abner and said, died Abner as a fool dieth? Thy hands were not bound, nor thy feet into fetters. As a man falleth before wicked men, so fellest thou. The question, did Abner die as a fool? The answer is yes and no. Yes, he died as a fool because he let down his guard. He surely had to know that Joab was still angry because he killed his younger brother. He knows that he and Joab have fought nonstop for years they have fought and fought. And when Joab said, "Come back," he never questioned. He didn't send to David to see if David wanted him to come back, or was it strictly Joab that wanted him to come back. And when Joab approached him, he did not notice the sword in Joab's hand until it went under his fifth rib. Did he die as a fool? In some ways, yes. He let down his guard. Joab took advantage. We could also say no, because dying as a fool also could mean that he died like a common prisoner. David is very clear. Did he die as a fool? No, his hands were not bound. His feet were not in fetters. He wasn't a common criminal. He was not a fool in the sense of being a foolish person who had committed crime and was being killed for his crime. He did not die like a prisoner. He was not bound like a prisoner. He fell before wicked men. And when wicked people turn against you, and wicked people have it in for you, it doesn't matter what you do as far as trying to defend yourself. Now, and this is very, very short. What can we take away from Abner? Number one, make certain that you are not the person always stirring up the pot. Abner kept Saul going for years, always keeping Saul stirred up, inciting Saul, pushing Saul, lying to Saul to get Saul to fight and kill David. Make certain that you and I are not the ones that are always stirring up trouble. You know, I've watched not much, but I've watched a little bit recently about y'all know what J6 is? Everybody know what J6 is? January the 6th, 2021. Anybody know what happened on January the 6th? That's when a riot took place. Trump supporters tried to burn down the White House. They took cannons and shot the walls down. They killed every policeman they came to. Now we find out, wow, I might as well. Now we have pretty good evidence that the Democrats had planted people in the crowd to hype them up, stir them up. Let's invade, let's go in. And they excited everybody else going in. And now there's a lot of evidence that looks like the Democrats planted those people to incite them, to stir them up, to get them all angry and worked up, to charge into the state or to the Capitol. You know how many people it takes to stir up a riot? I'm sorry? One. Thank you. Only takes one person. Do you know how many people it takes to divide a church? sometimes only one. I know that you and you don't get along very well. Now, this is make-believe. So I go to you and I say everything I can say against him to get you mad at him. Then I go to him, say everything I can say against you to keep you both fighting. And a lot of times that's what happens in churches. In the book of Acts, when that crowd of people began yelling for hours, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." If you read back just a few verses, you know how many people got that riot started? One man got it started. One man. Make certain, whether it be in church, whether it be in the family, in the community, Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. And there's a lot of Christians who think that their job is to always stir up strife. Make certain that is not you. Understand, second, understand people change. In the book of John, chapter 2, we find that Jesus had, done a couple things, and the whole multitude were coming, and they were going to make Jesus king right there on the spot. They were whole big crowd. Let's make him king. And they were coming to make Jesus king before his time. But I love John 2:24. Here's a whole crowd, perhaps hundreds, maybe thousands, a big crowd. Let's crown him king. But in verse 24, Jesus did not commit himself unto them, because he knew all men and needed not that any should testify of men, for he knew what was in man. Now Jesus did not allow them to make him king. First of all, it wasn't his time, but he knew that people changed. That same group of people that said, let's make him king, that same group, just a little bit later, same group was crying out, crucify him. They went from wanting to crown him king to hollering, crucify him. The person that, and I told you, my dad had more common sense than people with college degrees. And Dad taught us by word as well as example. Be careful when somebody starts really laying it on thick. You are the best guy I've ever met. I just think the world of you. You are wonderful. You are great. Watch them. While they're complimenting you, the other hand has the sword fixing to hit you in the back somewhere. People change. But then the third thing, if thy enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him water. Love your enemy. If they repent, forgive them. Abner showed evidence toward the end. He showed evidence, at least to David, that he had repented for all the things he did, all the things he said. He repented of leading a rebellion against David. How do you know that? Because David accepted him, believed him, took him in, forgave him, and made a peace treaty with him. I don't think, as wise as David was, he would have done that unless he saw something that indicated that Abner had changed and was sorry for his conduct. Sometimes people do attack us, say terrible things about us, lie on us, stir up people against us. But if they apologize, show evidence, we have every responsibility to take them at their word until they give proof otherwise, and to try our best to live peaceably with all men. David mourned at his funeral. It wasn't fake, wasn't phony, it wasn't crocodile tears. David mourned at his funeral because, as far as David was concerned, they had made up, and David was looking forward. How willing are you? You know, I heard the other day, and it's a verse that I have used in my personal self. Not necessarily public, but I've used it with myself a lot. Talks about our sins. God has cast our sins into the depth of the ocean, as far as the east is from the west. And here's the part I like. Never to be remembered against us anymore. When God forgives, he doesn't keep throwing it up. You offended me. I'm going to pick on you this time. You offended me. And though I forgive you, I'm going to remind you of it every chance I get, so that you'll always remember that you offended me. I'm going to remind you, and every time you do something wrong, I'm going to throw it up at you. Well, I know what you did. Oh, listen, people have done that to us. There are some people that will never forget what you did, but they always want you to forget what they did. Hey, as Christians, David was willing to forgive, forget. Let's go forward. Let's unite the kingdom. Let's unite the country, not north and south. Let's unite it as Israel, and let's march forward. Could you and I do that? Could we really, honestly, and truly unite with our enemy for the cause of Christ, assuming that there will